Welcome to the Meru Media podcast with Mukundaradu.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media podcast. Today, we are joined again by one of the guests we had earlier last year, Rami Shivan, who is an Acharya in Australia and belongs to Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya. Last time we had a great conversation covering a whole host of different topics, including, varnashrama, some little Buddhism, some aspects of Dharma Shastras. It was wide ranging. And this one, I think we want to maybe narrow it down a little bit and just have a shorter, more focused conversation. So Acharya, welcome to the podcast again. How are you?
Thank you very much. I am fine. Living the life, the dream down here in Australia.
Yeah, it's what, now summer for you guys, right?
Yes, it is. But it's been a very wet summer.
Yeah.
It's just, we've got flooding at the moment.
Oh man, that's something that, I'm in LA and we wish we had more rain here because we're in a drought.
Oh dear. You see, the problem that we have is that it's marriage season right now. And so there is a fantasy with brides for having an outside wedding. I don't know what it's like in America, but all Hindu brides now want outside weddings. And this is dampening a lot of their plans, their fantasies.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, as I mentioned, like I'm getting married in like 3 weeks. It's my second marriage, but this one's gonna last. But so this one, we're getting married in Cancun, in an outside wedding. But I think that the thing is, like, nowadays, especially, it's very pretty. I think people love the prettiness of doing an outside wedding with, like, by the beach with the water, and it feels like you're kind of communing with nature again. Maybe that could be one of the reasons.
Yeah, but it doesn't quite work with Hindu weddings because first of all, you cannot have a wedding in the open sky. You have to have a covering.
Yes.
And so the mandap has to be covered. And then you've got the problem of summer, heat, flies, guests standing outside. It's
well, I mean, in India, a lot of times, don't they do, I mean, I know they do some more in the north. They do weddings outside with like the mandap covered and everything like that. I've seen.
Well, it all depends on the climate. I mean, in the middle of winter, to have an outside wedding is very romantic, but then you've got flies. You don't have flies, but you've got wind, you've got rain. You've got all that inclement stuff that you have to take into account.
Right.
So and you can't light lamps, you can't light a fire, you can't, it becomes logistically very difficult.
Yeah, yeah.
But they are pretty, whatever, it's, brides. Weddings are about brides and their mothers.
That's what I hear, but I think mine's about me and I want to get my family and everyone together after COVID. So it's it's a little bit of both here. So how many weddings are you doing this season?
Say again?
How many weddings are you doing this season?
This year I've done about 15 since COVID ended. And I've got about 30 weddings for the rest of the year booked up, and I'm getting inquiries every day.
Wow, that's intense. That's a lot. That's one a week almost.
Almost one or even two a week sometimes.
And this is in addition to all your other work you do, your full-time job, your other acharya duties, your purohit duties.
And the thing is that weddings also include pre-wedding interviews, and then I do a rehearsal with all my couples.
Okay.
So I rehearse the entire wedding, which can take an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And then it's the performing of the wedding, and then it's pack up. It's logistically quite complex.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I guess, like, I kind of want to discuss one of two things today. Ideally, like, whether we can talk about the samskaras or we can talk about the Pancaratra, like, which do you feel more comfortable talking about today?
Well, probably for samskaras, I need to give you a little bit more technical information, which I don't really have at my fingertips. But I can give you a broad introduction to Pancaratra.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
The Pancaratra falls under the Agama or Tantra category of spirituality. And there is argument which came first. Was it the Vedika or the Agama? But these arguments are academic. Mm-hmm. The fact remains that the Vedika system was limited to the Dvijas, twice born.
Yeah.
And even then, the ritual, the samskaras, everything that was involved in the Vedas were specifically targeted towards the Dvijas, and they were very expensive. So all the Vedic yagyas, for example, they flourished under royal patronage because they required large teams of expert practitioners, months of preparation. The ceremonies used to go on for days on end, up, even over years. So they were out of the reach of the common people, and the vast majority of the people were not Dvijas, were they not twice born, and there was nothing for them. What kind of spirituality do you offer the common people? So this is where the Agama steps in, and so the Agama gives sort of mimics Vedic ceremonies, but for the common folk.
Okay.
So, for example, the temple became the co-relative of the Vedic Yagashala. So instead of having a Yagashala, you have a mandir or alaya. Instead of having the central Vedika or the altar, they would have the murti. So everything was transposed from the Yagashala into the structure of the Agamic temple. And then instead of the Vedic ceremonies, you would have utsavas, festivals. So the main utsava of an Agamic temple is the Brahmotsava, which is 10 days long, which was analogous to the Vedic ceremony, the basic Vedic ceremony of 10 days. It was actually 9 days plus 1, but we can get into that later. And so the Agamas presented exactly the same type of spirituality and knowledge and practice of the Vedas, but attuned to the common folk. Everybody had access to Pancaratra in spite of a lot of resistance, because the problem is that the Brahmins kind of take over stuff and they Brahminicize it.
Okay.
And I think this was one of the problems with the Pancaratra, because, for example, in Pancaratra, in the Ishvara Samhita, it says that a Shudra can be an Acharya.
Okay.
Now, if you ask any average Agama Pandit, they would say, no, only Brahmins can be Acharyas.
Right.
But in actual fact, I had a friend of mine actually wrote a whole blog based on the information that I gave him. And he established that Shudras can become Acharyas in an Agama temple for the purpose of Pratishta.
Pratishtha.
Plus that, they can be Archakas in the temple. And so he wrote this blog, and he actually got a lot of positive feedback from scholars, which said, yes, in actual fact, this is true. But common people were not too happy. The average Sri Vaishnava was not happy with this. They were not happy, but they couldn't dispute it because it's actually in the texts.
Right, right.
So in this way, Agama is open for everyone. So all the samskaras, for example, the Vedic samskaras, which we can talk about in the next podcast, they are given in the Agama as well. But the difference is that they do not use Vedic mantras. And
when you say they don't use Vedic mantras, are you meaning they don't use the mantras from the Vedas, or they chant them differently?
No, they don't use mantras from the Vedas at all.
Okay.
So for example, you've got the classical purification ceremony in the Veda is known as the Punya Vachana.
Yeah.
And it utilizes Vedic mantras. So in the Pancaratra Agama, you've got a Vasudeva Punya Vachana, which is just slokas.
Okay.
And there are no mantras. Well, technically speaking, a mantra only comes from the Veda.
Right.
What you find, all the other kind of verses that we recite are not technically speaking mantras, they are shlokas. So the Vasudeva Punya Vachana is all shlokas.
Yeah.
There is not a single Vedic mantra in those. Then all the ceremonies are done exactly the same as in the Vedas, but as I say, without any text from the Veda. The reason
is that because of the rule that non-Dvijas can't chant the Vedas, so therefore Agama kept that tradition, but just changed it or supplemented with their own?
Well, the problem with recite, like for example, when you do a traditional Sri Vaishnava marriage, you'll find that the Vaidya will ask you to repeat in Sanskrit Vedic mantras. Now, it is presumed that you've had pre-training. Because again, technically speaking, there are no domestic priests in the Vedic system, because the priests as a class only came after the decline of the Vedic system. And the reason being that you would go to the Gurukul and you would learn all the mantras and all the ceremonies and all the samskaras for yourself.
Yes.
So for example, in the Grihya Sutras, where it prescribes the marriage ceremony, it doesn't mention a priest. It says, you invite your wife to sit down, you take her hand, you say this while you're taking her hand. So there is no indication that there is a third party who is intervening or is actually managing the ceremony. You yourself are conducting everything for yourself. Now, with the decline of Vedic studies and Vedic tuition, there was this lacuna now. People didn't know how to do their own ceremonies because they hadn't undergone the training. So so a professional class of priests evolved that's why they call it in Tamil, we call them Vaidya. Vaidya means a teacher.
Yeah.
So he is there, only the Rajas had Purohits. So a domestic priest was appointed to a Raja, but generally people didn't have Purohits, they had Vaidyas. Who would teach you how to. So basically what he's doing is he's teaching you how to do the ceremony while the ceremony is going on.
I see.
Now, for a non-Dvija or a non-Brahmin, they didn't have that basic training in Veda. So they couldn't pronounce the mantras, they couldn't pronounce the swaras, and so they were exempt from using Vedic mantras in their ceremonies, but they could do the same ceremonies using easy Sanskrit shlokas, which the priest would then recite on their behalf. So they would not.
And this is in the Vedic system.
Correct.
Okay.
Now in Pancaratra, because the mantras are tantric mantras, they're simplified mantras, and they come from the Agamas, anybody can use them, anybody can recite them. Now, some people have, people that are into equality, diversity, they get kind of upset. Why different systems? Well, I always say, well, is it easier to learn something from a comic book or a PhD thesis?
Right.
You're learning the same information, but you're learning it in an easier format that's accessible.
I think people sometimes will be like, oh, that's patronizing, that's this, that's all that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think there's a realism that comes with this somewhat bifurcation of the Vedic knowledge into the Vedas and the Puranas and the Agamas. Is I feel like it's the realistic expectation that people don't have the time, dedication, money, or the ability to spend 25 years of your life learning, the Vedic texts to learn properly.
Well, exactly. I mean, a lot of the people, say, for example, now during my marriage season, the vast majority of the marriages that I'm doing are mixed marriages.
Yeah.
So one party is either of a different caste, or the other party is of a different ethnic group or religion.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're having dual marriages. So they'll have a Christian wedding and a Hindu wedding. So there's a lot of mixing and matching. So in the hour that I have to perform the ceremony, I need to give them something that is meaningful and something that is pertinent and applicable to that time frame. So although we recite all the mantras in Sanskrit, we get the couples to recite their vows in English.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
So we get them to recite their vows in English, and we give explanations throughout. So the couple and I go through about an hour and a half beforehand in the initial interview, explaining every stage of the marriage, every step of the marriage, what it means, what's the significance, what are the expectations, etc. So I get the couple to own the ceremony. And this is what I want. I want them to own the ceremony and not do the ceremony simply pro forma for the sake of their parents.
Right.
And then all the couples actually do own the ceremony, because they realize that the Vedic marriage ceremony is culturally neutral, but it's packaged in a Indian cultural package. But the vows are universal.
That's right.
And so the same stuff is given to people, but in an easier format.
Now, like weddings themselves are generally Vedic, right? They're not agamic, correct?
Correct, but there are actually, for everything in the I suppose you need to go back a little bit of history here.
Sure.
A lot of people, a lot of commentators think of when you ask them what is your understanding of the caste system, they'll say, oh, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Sudras. Brahmins were the priests, Kshatriyas were the warriors, Vaishyas were the farmers, and the Sudras were the peasants, the serfs, the laborers. This was the model when it was an agricultural-based civilization 2,500, 3,000, even more, 4,000 years ago. But from the time of the Guptas onwards, from about the 3rd century, the society became a lot, even prior, around about 500, the time of the Buddha, you already had sophisticated cities and international trade.
Sure.
Remember that Rome and Greece were trading with South India.
Right.
And so with the international trade came artisans that produced quality fine goods for export. So there's weaving, jewelry, pottery, carpentry, metalwork. Sure. All of this was controlled by the Shudras. Now the Vaishyas moved from farming into banking. And they moved because if you remember, the Vaishyas, the Jagat Seths, actually financed the Mughals and the British.
That's right. Yeah.
And so they went into mercantile, trading, entrepreneurial stuff. The farming was taken over by the Shudras. So the cattle rearing, the farming that was originally the Vaishya occupation became the occupation of the Shudras. So the Shudras became landowners. They became the primary food producers. And the 5 Kamalar, in South India, we call them as the 5 Kamalar castes. And in North India, they were the Vishwakarma castes.
Yeah.
Were the highly skilled metal workers, carpenters, goldsmiths, silversmiths, all of these people. Now, with the rise of the temple architecture, the temple culture in about the 3rd century, everything involved with the temple was in the hands of the Shudras. So it's the architects, the planners, the builders, the sculptors, the stonemasons, the metal workers, the farmers that produced the stuff. The entire economy of the temple was Shudra based. And the Shudras became very powerful. In South India, particularly the Velala Shudra caste became extremely powerful in terms of their socioeconomic punch. And they managed the temples. So the temple management was Shudra, everything. The only involvement of the Brahmins was actually becoming the Archakas. And they were employed by the Shudras to serve in the temple. So this model, this original model of four castes, farmers, laborers, was defunct 2,000 years ago. Now, what happened is that as the Shudras became more economically powerful and there was the decline in the Vedic culture and the sponsorship of the Brahmins, so they had to shift their business model because they no longer had royal patronage, and particularly with the Mughal Empire, the Rajas were insignificant. And so they realized that their economic base was the Shudra community. So what they started doing, and I think the movement, roughly, I could be corrected on this, it started around Maharashtra. There were some very learned scholars that decided that they had to start including the Shudras in the whole cultural format.
Sure.
So they started writing books like Kamalakara Bhattar was one of the main movers and shakers in this. So they wrote books on Shudra, Dharma, Prakasha, and they started developing samskaras for the Shudras based on using Pauranika and Tantric mantras.
I see.
So they, and then also, like in North India, for example, they use the Vedic. So there's two formats. There's Vedokta and there's Puranokta.
Okay.
So Puranokta is based on the Puranas. And again, all the samskaras, everything reappear in the Puranas with Puranic shlokas.
Right.
Which is easy Sanskrit. So as anybody that has a basic knowledge of Sanskrit can read this and understand it, whereas Vedic mantras are impossible to understand unless you know archaic Vedic Sanskrit.
Right.
And so the Agamas as well started catering to the Shudra community. And so we had all this original Vedic samskaras now in easy to use user-friendly format. Sorry. And so you had the pure Punya Vachanam, which was now became the Vasudeva Punya Vachanam, which was applicable to everyone. Women were given, previously women were excluded from samskaras as well. So now they were included, they could have all the samskaras done for them. And so the whole culture shifted position from being Veda-based to Agama-based. So what is practiced as Hinduism today is 90% Tantra / Agama and only about 10% Veda.
Interesting. I mean, like texts like Ishwar Samhita or even here Buddha Samhita, these are pretty ancient, right? They're like 2,000 years or something of that nature, correct?
Some of them are, well, there is an argument that some of them are pre-Buddhist.
Yeah.
Because they don't, the Agamas, the older Agamas, and remember that there are hundreds of Agama texts. The older Agamas do not enumerate Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu.
Right, right.
But some of the later Agamas that were written in the, like sort of 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, they do include Buddha as an avatar.
So I guess my question is those early Agamas in the Pancaratra there, were they already including Shudras as Acharyas in the text, or was that a later development coinciding with what you're talking about?
Well, the whole tantric movement was an inclusive movement.
Mm-hmm.
And what the theory is that the Tantra and the Veda operated parallel.
I see.
So at the time that the Brahmins had their Vedas, the common people were practicing Tantra.
But at the same time, I mean, isn't it the ones that wrote the tantras are also the brahmanas, correct? Like
yeah. Well, we come now to the problem of actually authorship, because although the Brahmins were considered to be the authors of all these texts, we don't really know for sure.
Sure.
It could have been some learned scholars of the Vaishya community or the Kshatriyas. In actual fact, the Upanishads, for example, most of the teachers are Kshatriyas.
Right.
And the Brahmins go to the Kshatriyas to learn from them.
That's right.
This actually illustrates a very important aspect, that according to the Buddhist and the Jain texts, the hierarchy was Kshatriyas at the top.
Right.
Followed by the Brahmins, Vaishyas, and Shudras.
Right.
In the work written by the Brahmins, they put themselves on the top.
Right. Right.
All right. So we have this discrepancy. But then in the Upanishads, you see that the Kshatriyas are in actual fact the top dogs, to use
right. It was like the Raja, she's like Janaka or someone like that, right? Yeah. That they would come to advice for. And so on this point, I would ask, so the Pancaratra tradition, in some sense, you know, the first I remember reading about it was in the Mahabharata and the Narayaniya section of the Shanti Parva, yes. Right? So correct. Now, is that the first instance of us hearing about it, or is there, because I also heard this other position that we can find the Pancaratra tradition connected to the Taittiriya Samhita in the Yajurveda, but I'm not sure of these connections. I have not looked into that, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, a lot of these connections are tendentious. It's very hard to prove them because Indian literature is so complex.
Yeah.
And there are many different authors, and literature has been interpolated and extrapolated. And so it's very hard to actually tie it down into sequential developments. But sure. We have, for example, there's a Garuda column that was erected by a Greek convert to Vaishnavism. That's correct. And so we do have some inscriptions of Greeks becoming Vaishnavas. And there's mention of a Greek Vaishnava community around Mathura. And so we do have, and then in these inscriptions, you have snippets of Pancharatric theology of Vasudeva, of Sankarshana, Pradyumna, these kind of things coming through, but you don't have any like sort of structured Pancharatric theology, which came later with the development of the texts.
Sure.
Over the centuries. And I guess the texts, just by speculating, came into prominence with the temple culture, which is said to start around the 3rd century.
Right.
So with the building of the temples, you needed manuals on how to build the temples, what the criteria of the building of the temples were, the inauguration, the consecration, all that kind of stuff. So you needed texts to actually give you the guidance. So that's when the Agamas started being produced. Sure. And so all the Agamas give you different aspects of temple culture. It's, what are the implements used? What are the ceremonies to perform? What are the festivals? What, all that kind of stuff. So among that work, and as far as I know, it's only the Ishvara Samhita that actually gives you gives you the criteria for an Acharya being a Shudra, although the other Agamas also do mention Shudras as being fully involved in the temple culture.
Right. So how far, like, if we focus on the Pancaratra tradition itself, how far do we have a sense of when it probably originated, and what was its first, like, what were its first expressions in I guess in historic time?
Do you want the mythological or the historical account?
You can do both.
Well, the mythological account is that it goes back to 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
The actual historical account would probably put it in the, around the beginning of the Common Era.
Okay.
It's like the Alvars as well. If you read the hagiographic accounts, they're all in, end of Kali, at the beginning of the Kali Yuga.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the linguistic, the Tamil linguistic, Sangam, et cetera, you put in those factors, you'll see that they're all much, much later.
Sure.
We're talking about the Sangam Tamil era. So you've got the legendary accounts and the actual historical accounts from the archaeology and from the actual texts themselves, which would put them around the 1st, 2nd century when it started developing.
As a full system.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have references to the the theology of the Pancaratra as like the Chaturvidyas, yeah.
We also have refutation of Pancaratra. There's quite early on, there's I think it was even Shankaracharya tried to he refute
Yes.
Pancaratra. He said that it was non-Vedic.
Yeah.
And there are quite a few early, I mean, I don't remember their names at the moment, early acharyas that condemned the Pancaratra because of non-Vedic practices like branding, for example.
Right.
That was considered Avedika. But then the Vedanta Desika actually wrote a whole treatise supporting that based on Vedic texts. Like the Atapta Tanorna Tadama Ashnute was a Vedic dictum which said a body which is not tapta, which hasn't been heated, cannot reach the highest state. Does it actually refer to the tapa mudra? That's another thing. But
yeah, that's right.
Tapta Tanor can be a body that a person who has not undergone austerities.
Right.
Because tapas is austerities. So it could also mean a person who has not undergone rigorous austerities cannot achieve enlightenment.
Right.
And you could also interpret as, okay, if you haven't had your tapa mudra, then you won't get paramapada.
So on the Pancaratra, what are the main elements of Pancaratra, right? Like we know there's the Vyuha system, there's the temple, and then there's like mantra, and then there's something else it escapes me. Isn't there 4 main elements within the Pancaratra system?
Well, actually, it breaks down to 5 main elements, and you see, the thing is that there are a lot of. I don't have the. If you'd give me some preparation,
I apologize.
I pulled it all up for you, so I'm just running on my cognitive declining state and trying to remember stuff. But Agama covers all aspects of an individual's life. So you have we got the 4 sections of Agama: Charya, Yoga, Jnana, Charya, Yoga, and Kriya. So the Jnana Bhaga covers the knowledge aspect. So that is all that is akin to in Veda, you've got 3 sections: Jnana Kanda, Karma Kanda, and Upasana Kanda. So Jnana Kanda is your knowledge. And so again, in Pancaratra, you have the Jnana Pada that gives you the whole philosophy, and everything that's in the Vedas is presented here. But once again, the Jnana Kanda of the Vedas, which is embodied in the Upanishads, was only accessible to Dvijas.
Yeah.
Whereas the Jnana Kanda of the Pancaratra is the same knowledge now revealed to everyone, regardless of gender, caste, creed, or whatever. Everybody can study the same knowledge through the Pancaratra. Then the Charya Pada gave you conduct. How do you conduct your life? What do you do when you wake up in the morning? How do you bathe? How do you live your daily life? What are your value systems? And then Kriya, it gives you the ritual practice, what your daily ritual practice in your home, shrine. And then that covers also the temple ritual practice. Then Yoga Pada covers your yoga, your meditation, your intensive internal spiritual practice. Whereas Kriya Pada is about external rituals, whereas Yoga Pada is more about your inner spiritual development. So these are the four major sections that are covered in all the tantras. Now, when you talk about, you may want to know what is the difference between Tantra and Agama. Tantra and Agama cover the same topics of spirituality, spiritual practice, but the Agama gives there are more subsections in the Agama than there are in the Tantra.
But Pancaratra, is that considered both Agama and Tantra?
Well, it is. Agama and Tantra are used synonymously.
Okay.
So they exchange. But generally speaking, Vaishnavas, we don't refer to our texts as tantras, although there are some tantras. We refer to them as agamas. And the Shaivites also refer to their texts as agamas. The Shaktas refer to their texts as tantras.
Is there a reason for that difference, or?
Not really. Tantra, the root meaning of Tantra is Tane te Jnana manena iti Tantra. That by which knowledge, it means to spread. So that by which knowledge is spread is the Tantra.
Yeah.
Then Agama means that which has come down to us.
Yeah.
Gam meaning going. So Agama, that which is the tradition that has been passed down to us from the ancient antiquity. But so, I mean, it's basically the same stuff.
Same stuff,
and
okay.
It's primarily deity, what we'd call today as deity yoga, which is the utilization of imagery and forms in order to concentrate, to meditate, rather than using abstract imagery.
Right. And that's where we get, the murtis and the mandalas and the visualizations that we use across, right? But there's also this mapping, right, of phenomes to visualizations, correct? Also, is that present in Pancaratra tradition like it is in Kashmir Shaivism?
Yeah, it's basically all the same techniques, but with slight variations. That's the thing. It's just a standard kind of giving you structure for your spiritual practice, which is all designed along the same rules and regulations.
Right. And what's the theology of the Pancaratra tradition?
Well, there is, some people would argue that it is, you've got this debate going on about personalism, impersonalism. Whether Pancaratra is actually personalist or does it have elements of Advaita, non-dualism in it.
Right.
In my readings, both streams of thought come through in Pancaratra. There are statements, again, I can't recall offhand, but in future I can make sure that I have these quotes all ready for you.
This is my fault, but yes, absolutely.
This is what comes from lack of preparation. So, for example, there is a statement that says, Nirakara tu devesha na archanam bhavendranam nacha dhyanam nacha stotram tasmat sakaram archayet. So it says, Nirakara tu devesha na archanam bhavendranam. So it says a God that is without form, Nirakara, cannot be worshipped.
In form.
Or cannot be dhyana. You cannot meditate or do anything with a formless deity. Tasmat sakaram archayet. Therefore, it is in your best interests and to facilitate your spiritual progress to worship God through form. So just in this one verse alone, it is not saying that Nirakara is a higher or lower form of worship.
Right.
It's just saying, well, look here, Nirakara, although in the Narayana Upanishad, for example, it says that Sriman Narayana is Nirvikalpa, Nirakara, Agochara, cannot be imagined, is transcendent, absolute. So the Pancaratra echoes that yes, the absolute Sriman Narayana is inconceivable and inexpressible. But Having said that, what can we do with that? And the ultimate test of knowledge if you go back to your Mimamsa classes, which I know that you underwent, Prama, or valid knowledge, is defined as knowledge which describes a thing as it is and is practicably useful.
Right. And that's the key element. It's practically useful.
Yeah. And this is the key to understanding all of the theory in Hinduism is all about pragmatism.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with this knowledge? So yes, God, Sriman Narayana is Nirakara, is impersonal. But what can we do with that? You can't do anything with it. And we need something to link. And the Pancaratra also says that if you do not have a link or something upon which to direct your thoughts, your mind will wander away in meditation.
Right.
And this is another thing that's neglected a lot. In Pancaratra, there is a huge emphasis on meditation. And I've had this discussion with a number of acharyas. For example, Velkudi. I said to him once at a public meeting, I said, Pancaratra stresses Bhagavad Dhyana, meditation on God. And even Ramanuja said that Bhagavad Dhyana is moksha upaya.
Yeah.
The later, especially the Tengale Sri Vaishnavas completely neglected that and said, oh, there's no moksha upaya, and it's just Sharanagati.
Right.
The Vadagalai still retained that moksha upaya business, but even then they did not stress on Bhagavad Dhyana.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked him, why is this? So he said, oh, everybody knows how to meditate. I said, no, they don't. Meditation is a particular technique that has to be taught.
Right.
And he was evasive. He was not happy with the question. And yeah, so, and a lot of my students have gone back to India and they've gone to acharyas and they've said, why are you not teaching Bhagavad Dhyana?
Yeah.
Why is there are no classes in it? There's no instruction. And even archakas, before they actually begin the daily puja or archana in the temple, are supposed to do about 40 minutes of Bhagavad Dhyana.
Now, is Bhagavad Dhyana very similar to like Namasmriti or meditation on just remembrance in that sense, or is it a different practice than simple remembrance?
It's a whole practice of deity visualization. So, for example, you do a bhuta shuddhi, which is a purification of the elements of the body, in which you visualize that the body is, it's actually preparation for death, because you visualize your body, the earth element dissolving, the water element dissolving, the fire element, the air element, and then you're basically on the akasha element. And then you visualize Sriman Narayana standing above your head or in your heart, and you hold that visualization. And again, according to the Pratyahara Dharana Dhyana Samadhi of Patanjali,
yeah,
where you're doing Pratyahara, you're withdrawing your mind from external contact with sense objects, you're directing your Pratyahara, and then you've got your Dharana. Dharana is holding the image in your mind. And as Ramanuja says, it becomes the Taila Dharavat. Taila Dharavat, like a stream of oil poured from one vessel into another, unbroken. Yeah. That is how your mental thought on the form of Vishnu.
Yeah.
And then you dissolve that form into yourself. So you merge into the deity. And then again, you reconstruct your body from there. So there's a whole process of Bhuta Shuddhi and Bhagavad Dhyana that needs to be taught and practiced. It's not something that you are just, DIY.
Yeah, you can't read it on the internet and do it yourself.
This is how I do it. So it's a whole process of training, and it's arduous training, and you need to do hours and hours and hours of practice of this system. to get it right. So that is done prior to you actually in the sanctum, prior to beginning your daily archana.
Yeah.
And there is also a statement in the Agama which says, Bhagavat Sanidhyam Archakasya Tapo Balat. That the Sanidhyam, the presence of the deity in the temple, is dependent entirely on the meditative capacity of the archaka.
Very interesting. That's not heard that before.
Yeah, so it's very significant when you look at it, that Bhagavat Sanidhyam Archakasya Tapo. Tapa here means meditation.
Yeah, the austerities, yeah.
Yeah, your austerities, the degree, Balat. So the Sanidhyam is based on the tapas of the archaka. So if the archaka is not doing this daily Bhagavat Dhyanam, then he is not performing tapas.
Yeah.
And therefore the Sanidhyam would not be there.
Wow.
But again, this, in all the archakas that I've ever spoken to, this is not something that is, really there may be teachers, acharyas that do teach this. I mean, obviously, I haven't done a survey of a quality control survey of all the archaka training colleges, but the archakas that I have met and spoken to don't seem to be actually practicing this. It's all very pro forma. They arrive, open the temple, clap their hands, start doing their work. None of this preparatory. When I was studying Pancaratra, my Bhagavat Aradhana that I wrote by hand, remember, those days there were no printed notes. Everything had to be written by hand. The morning Bhagavat Aradhana would go on for about 4 to 5 hours.
Every day.
Every day. And that's if you're doing it properly, if you're doing it according to the Pancaratra Agama. So you'd be waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and you'd be doing your visualizations and meditations and contemplation, and that would go on for hours before you actually even started your invocation.
Wow. So it is as if like the entire day is taken up with the Bhagavat, Aradhana in some sense.
Correct. And that would take you up to lunchtime. And then after that, you'd have your nap, your siesta, and then you start again at 4 o'clock and go up to 9, 10 o'clock at night. So it's a full-time involvement.
Yeah.
And so obviously the Bhagavad Aradhana that I learned, the classical, the prototype, has been simplified for householders.
Right.
And so nowadays you just do a very brief Bhagavad Aradhana of, maybe 30 minutes or something, but that is very much abbreviated.
Wow. I mean, when you look at it, like even when I look at the Dharma Shastras and now what you're explaining, it's like to follow any of these things, it's your entire life. There's nothing outside of that except for this.
Oh, absolutely. That's why even today, there's a big problem that archakas cannot find wives in India because people do not want to marry their daughter. First of all, young girls, educated girls that are going to university don't want to marry an archaka. Who's going to spend his entire life in the temple.
Yeah.
And from morning to night. And there's also all the rules and regulations that go with being an archaka in a temple.
Right.
So the rules and regulations are just oppressive. So
but is that from the Vaikanasa or Pancaratra Agama, or is that something they put on themselves?
No, well, it's in the Agama that priests can't do this, can't do that, you can't, all your rules and regulations. And because it's all about purity, maintaining your purity and your suitability, your adhikaratva to actually do the aradhana.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting.
But next time, when you give me some time, I can prepare you all the quotes, and then I can just dazzle people with.
No, that's fine, because I'm sure you have to go now. We'll keep this episode short, but I want to do a part 2 on this where we can discuss more of the theology of it, like the Chaturvyuhas and all of that, and like even things of connected to Lakshmi Tantra and its nature of Purusha Prakriti. I just find all that fascinating, the way the entire evolute comes out.
Excellent.
Excellent. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us today. It's a shorter episode, but we are going to have a few more sessions with the Acharya here, and we'll get more and more topics. Thanks.
यमुना तीरे गायती वनमाली गायती वनमाली मधुरं गायती वन